The proceeding will start.
The Science, Innovation and Technology Committee is in session, and this afternoon we continue our inquiry into emerging diseases and lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic. And we start by looking at the preparedness that we are in the UK for on diagnostics for emerging diseases, following some earlier evidence sessions. To help us with that, we're very pleased to welcome Nicola Newman, who joins us here in Westminster. Ms. Newman is the Managing Director of the Berkshire and Surrey Pathology Service, one of the largest pathology networks in England, and she's been there for the last 4 years and has 20 years' experience working in NHS pathology laboratories. During the COVID pandemic, Ms. Newman was responsible for running the COVID-19 Lighthouse Laboratory at Brampton on behalf of the UK Health Security Agency. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And joining us virtually is Sarah Brampton, who is the Deputy Chief Executive of the University Hospitals Plymouth NHS Trust. Ms. Brampton joined the NHS in 1996 and has worked in various NHS organisations, again, for more than 20 years. Thank you very much indeed, both of you, for joining us. Now, the relevance of both of your organisations is that you are under contract with the UK Health Security Agency to provide diagnostic, i.e. testing services, in the event that they're needed in the event of a future pandemic. Now, this committee took extensive evidence during the course of the COVID pandemic into testing capacity. And it's fair to say it was one of the aspects of the response to the pandemic that was least satisfactory. Indeed, at many times it was shambolic. It took us a long time to ramp up, as the phrase that was used was, to an adequate level of testing capacity. During the pandemic, a number of lighthouse laboratories were established, including in both of your trusts. Members of the committee visited one of those laboratories, the Rosalind Franklin Laboratory in Leamington Spa. But they have been, as a decision of the UK Health Security Agency, discontinued, closed, and will no longer be there. In answer to our questions, the UKHSA has pointed to your organisations and the contracts that are in place as providing the necessary security that will have an adequate diagnostics facility. So that is the context. So perhaps I can start, Ms. Newman, with your organisation and tell me what types of services are you under contract to provide in the event of a future pandemic to the health security agencies?
Thank you. So we currently provide a fully UKAS accredited multiplex PCR test. That multiplex contains diagnostics for COVID-19, also influenza A and B, and respiratory syncytial virus, or RSV. We've also undertaken some research for UKHSA during this time in the form of comparison studies, such as how lateral flow devices compare to qPCR, and also some sample tube longevity studies. During the pandemic, we processed over 8 million COVID-19 PCR tests on behalf of UKHSA. And we're still providing that service to UKHSA in the form of multiplex PCR testing, but in much lower volumes now. So we're currently processing around about 400 samples a day, and we are currently contracted to provide that till the end of March 24 this year. After March 24, we do have a subsequent contract which runs till the 30th of June, where we will be providing a standby service. So we will be a standby service. So we will be maintaining the facility and the equipment within the facility, and we'll have a much scaled down workforce of around 20 people, but we will not be commissioned within the contract to provide any more testing from the end of this financial year.
And that standby facility, you say that is from June or to June, the contract?
June.
To June.
We don't have a contract beyond the end of June 2020.
You have no contract in place with the Health Security Agency for any activity beyond June?
Correct.
Is that because you don't want to have such a contract, or you haven't been offered one, or is it in a process of negotiation?
No, so we are very supportive and engaged with UKHSA colleagues, very supported to continue our resilience efforts and support to UKHSA. They are aware that we are keen to continue with our pandemic preparedness and resilience testing with them, but we do not have a contract beyond the end of June.
Do you have any insight as to why that might be? If we're talking about future preparedness, and to be fair, it's the UKHSA's responsibility to provide that, why do you think they'd be anxious to have you contracted rather than the other way around?
So I understand it's probably a question for UKHSA colleagues, but I understand there are challenges around financial approvals to progress with a longer term contract.
I see. Okay, well, let me perhaps ask the same question to Sarah Brampton down in Plymouth. What is your current contractual relationship with UKHSA?
Yeah, so very similar. So in Plymouth, our Lighthouse laboratory was a bespoke facility stood up in response to the pandemic. It was commissioned from March 21 and designed to give a high throughput for PCR testing. So it supported the COVID-2 pandemic response. We ramped up quickly to 20,000 tests per day and then ramped up at the request of UKHSA to deliver up to 50,000 tests during the height of the pandemic. We are currently, though, not doing any tests, and our contract, in similar vein to Ms Newman's, runs out at the end of June 24.
And do you have any insights as to why that contract has not been renewed?
Similar to Ms Newman, really, in that I suspect it is about staffing and resourcing.
Interesting. I mean, we will come on to this, but just for context for colleagues, the committee was written to by Jenny Harries at the end of September last year, pointing to the assurance that should be taken from the fact that UKHSA holds retainer contracts with Berkshire and Surrey Pathology Service and University Hospitals Plymouth laboratories, which could support surge testing as required. So when that letter was written to us on the 29th of September last year, just to confirm, you weren't in contract. It's not that the contract has been terminated. It only went to the end of the financial year or June. Is that correct?
Yes. So we had a contract with UKHSA until the end of this financial year, and then in January this year, UKHSA offered a 3-month new look contract for us, which runs until the end of June. So the current contract that we have with UKHSA until the end of March 24 is to provide a surge capacity as required to be able to test 30,000 what we call pathogen X PCR tests within a 30-day period. Currently, we are providing capacity for 5,000 tests per day, but as I said earlier, we're only processing around about 400 samples per day. In terms of the contracts from the 1st of April until the end of June, we go into what's termed within the contract a freezing state, so we will no longer, there's no money within that contract to do any testing, so we then go into standby to maintain the machines, and a real core workforce of around about 20 people who would be responsible for scaling up that facility should we need it going forward. And in terms of that contract for the 3 months, we have a commitment to scale up the facility to 60,000 pathogen X PCR tests per day within a 12-week period.
Okay. Well, I'm going to turn to my colleagues who've got some more detailed questions, starting with Carol Monaghan and then James Davis.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's quite interesting because the impression we've been given is that there is capacity to scale up, but you seem to be saying, yes, there is until June, but beyond June, you don't have capacity for that. Can I check, first of all, the 20 staff, did you say? 24 staff?
Yes, so we're currently running the facility on around about 50 staff because we're still doing live testing, about 400 PCR tests per day. But then from the 1st of April, we will go down to a core group of 20 staff.
What will they do? You've said maintain machines, that's a lot of staff just to maintain machines.
So they will maintain the machines. There may be work that we could do with UKHSA around validating assays. We're working closely with suppliers and have done over this latter quarter to modify our equipment. So the technology that we had in the laboratory was for COVID-19 testing only. So we are hoping that we can continue to work with our technology provider to open those platforms to then be able to respond more broadly, what's sort of termed pathogen X, to a more broader range of respiratory pathogens, for example. So, but that workforce is a core workforce which will allow to scale up and ramp up to our contractual obligations that really would provide the validation and verification of those assays, the technology expertise, the ability to train and mobilise a workforce rapidly.
Beyond June, what happens to them?
So beyond June, our contract ceases at the end of June. So we've had a workforce of over 400 people at the peak of the pandemic when we were doing sort of 50,000+ COVID samples per day. We have a large pathology network of over 1,600 individuals across the 6 hospitals that are in our pathology partnership. So we've taken 10% of that workforce historically into our pathology network. So with the remaining staff, we are hoping also that they will integrate within our pathology network as well.
Are there any examples since COVID of where your services have been used for a public health outbreak? I'm thinking, for example, Mpox. No. And could ask the same to Sarah.
Yeah, no, we did offer to provide support for Mpox, but we weren't taken up on our offer.
Any idea where was doing testing for that?
I don't know, sorry.
No. Okay. And in terms of, if we look at current infectious diseases, what's your current capacity, Nicola, if I start with you, in terms of diagnostic? You were doing 50,000 a day?
That's right. So our current contractual commitment is to provide the ability to surge to 30,000 tests per day within a 30-day period.
Could you do that within 30 days, do you think, just
We
now?
could do that. So we have a current capacity to provide 5,000 tests per day and currently receiving around about 400. So, but based on previous experience, we have good confidence that if we needed to scale up the facility...
30,000 in 30 days?
Yes.
Okay, and again, Sarah, could ask you the same question.
So similarly, so we could ramp up to 8,000 tests per day within 30 days, and it would take us 14 weeks to get back up to 50,000 tests per day.
Okay, and just a final question. Post-June, which seems to when these contracts are ending, how quickly could you scale up?
Again,
sorry, I'll start with Nicola and then come to you, Sarah.
Well, we wouldn't have a contract without the end of June, so we would release the facility, the equipment would go back to UKHSA, so I don't really have a readable way to scale up a facility.
It doesn't,
again.
that you don't have?
Yes, so...
So slightly different in that our facility is off-site, so we will maintain the facility. We are going to use it for decanting from our hospital site for our future hospital build. We will maintain the equipment, so if we were given an additional contract, we could ramp up, recruit the staff and be ready to run within 14 weeks to maximum capacity.
Where would the staff come from?
Well, we have a really good relationship with a recruitment agency that we used during the pandemic, and we would use that recruitment programme that we put in place during the pandemic to get those staff back. The staff tend to be local staff from the university, from science organisations around the southwest that we are keeping in touch with. We've also employed quite a lot of biomedical scientists within the hospital that we would second to the Lighthouse Laboratory.
Yeah, the final question, Chair. Just to clarify that. So during the pandemic, we know that a lot of university students came and lent their services So this would be, you would envisage a similar situation where
Yes.
it would be people being seconded or leaving university courses to come and provide the service?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. A couple of colleagues have got some supplementaries on this, and as do I. I mean, obviously, you're both running NHS trusts. You're there to cater for the health needs of your local population. So I would assume it's the case that you can't simply keep people on permanently without a contract, in other words, payment. Otherwise, this would be detrimental to the service that you provide to your local patients. Ms. Newman? Yeah. And the same with Plymouth. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Catherine Fletcher, I think, had a
Thank you, Chair.
supplementary.
I thank you for coming, to this building and for your time. I'm grateful for your expertise and your time today. 20 people to keep a lab going when no tests are going through it could raise some eyebrows. And I just wanted to kind of push slightly on the answer you gave to my colleague Carol about what they're actually doing to maintain a facility that's not got any tests going through it. Could you perhaps share that? Because annualised, that's a big number. Yeah.
And I think it's about retaining a number on the future ramp up and scale of the facility. So it is really dictated about the speed and pace that we want to scale up at. And if you go lower than that, you then push out the ability to scale up the facility at the speed and pace that was asked of us within the current contract. So to get to 60,000 tests in 12 weeks is mobilising a workforce of over 400 individuals from not just sort of agencies, as Sarah says, but we draw on our local pathology networks, our university colleagues. We have close links with the Pirbright Institute, who's just up the road. So to mobilise that amount of workforce and to respond in terms of validation and verification of new assays and scaling up equipment and getting the training and competencies and working with our accrediting body to ensure that we meet UKAS standards going forward. It is a massive commitment. We could go slower, you could go on a lower number, and that's really up to UKHSA around how they wanted to, if they can, shape a future contract around that future pandemic preparedness. But I think we've sort of heard from others within this committee who talk about keeping the light on and that sort of muscle memory, and it's the ability of how much capacity does one want to sit on to have ready, and that's really dictated.
That's really helpful. So it's not a technical maintenance of the machines that those 20 people would be doing. It's more about the readiness to press the button and go and get the whole thing get set back up again. If a contract wasn't awarded post June, but somebody asked you to maintain kind of a capacity that, I grant you, would not be as quick had you got 20 people sat around waiting to go and being paid to do it. Would they literally be doing nothing, or would they actually be repurposable to other tasks within your organisation?
So there is an element of maintaining the facility. In terms of our machines, they don't form well if they stand idle. So these are high throughput analysers that do need ticking over and sort of regular maintenance of samples going through them, even if it's a low volume. So there is an amount of that work to be done. That said, during the pandemic and in the quieter times and during our contracts with UKHSA, we've seconded some of our individuals to other UKHSA sites, such as the Cambridge site. We've seconded individuals into our NHS pathology network and used the opportunity to really develop those scientists and give them state registration. We're working with the Institute of Biomedical Scientists to get them as HCPC state-registered biomedical scientists. So we've really tried to develop and retain that workforce and not stand idle, but what else could we do with that workforce? And then we've sort of touched on some of the work that we've done with UKHSA around validating and comparing assays, and also working with industry providers as well.
Yeah.
Perhaps, I think Ms Brampton had a hand up. She wanted to come in on that before I go to Stephen and then James.
I just wanted to build on that. So the staff that we have on our lab at the moment, so we have 30 staff at the moment, all of which are bank staff and are seconded back into the hospital. So we have such a turnover of staff in our pathology department that we can always make good use of these staff. So no one is sat idle. I think we have one engineer on the lab that's there to maintain the equipment.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Catherine. Stephen had a supplementary, then we'll go to James.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, both. Sarah, it was just a point you were making about ramping up staff and saying that you had a good relationship with an agency who had used before. I'm just concerned that if that capacity were needed again, the environment from which you would be recruiting from, I think, would be very different than it might have been during the height of the pandemic, which means that staff may not be as available to fill those roles because they would be fulfilling their primary roles more readily. Have you given that any thought about what if you couldn't recruit because we are more used to home working around pandemics, if you did need to recruit staff?
Yeah, so recruitment, particularly to this hospital, is always a big topic for us in all professions. So we work really closely with the university in terms of lessons learned. So we have taken a lot of learning from the recruitment campaign for the Lighthouse Laboratory and what we can do to strengthen relationships, particularly with science graduates. I guess we're fortunate in that we live in a holiday destination, so there is always temporary workforce that we can call upon. So we haven't got all the answers, but we are aware that we were fortunate with the lockdown situation, but that might not happen again. So we are thinking about other ways. How do we grow our workforce? How do we strengthen our relationships with the University of Plymouth and our schools as well? Okay, so it's work in progress.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Gemma.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything, Ms Newman?
Very much agree, Chair, and those local relationships with both the universities, for us, we also have close working relationships with the Pirbright Institute.
Thank you very much indeed. So James Davis, then actually back to Stephen McCubbin.
Chair, just rounding off the contracts issue with UKHSA, is it a real problem that you don't have the certainty beyond June? And if you were to have a contract rolled over or a new one, would the terms that you already have be adequate for you to plan for the future, do you think?
So I think it is challenging around the current contract. So from mid-May, we would need to look at redeploying the workforce in order to exit at the end of June. So it is a problem, and it also means the short-term nature of the contract extensions is we're paying a premium for some things, so such as our warehouse leasing on a short-term lease. So it does come at a cost.
Right. Thank you. And Sarah, please.
Yeah, similar. We plan in the NHS on a 12-month basis, so it is really helpful to have certainty for at least 12 months ahead, so we can understand how we are going to access our resources and how we are going to deploy them. So having a 3-month contract isn't helpful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, understood. And a much more general question, really, about the challenges that exist in being pandemic ready, so in having diagnostics capability for the UK. What are those challenges and how could they be overcome? To Nicola first, please.
So I think sort of looking back, the relationships with suppliers and industry is key. And I think that could be strengthened based on our experiences. And for us, sort of building a laboratory capability, understanding what was available within the market was really key. And that actually really drives the design and build of the laboratory and also the type of workforce that you need based on the technology available. So I think strengthening those relationships would certainly help us going forward. I think something that's been spoken about in this committee previously around the variety of test tubes, that did make a huge impact for us when you have such high throughput automated platforms to just receive these tubes and try and turn around them very quickly. We have to validate and verify. The manual handling becomes a lot greater, and also you run a risk of contamination in the facility. So that supply chain was particularly challenging. I think by the time our COVID laboratory came online, a lot of the broader supply chain issues had actually passed by the time we owned our facility.
Okay, that's really helpful, thank you. Are there any additional thoughts from Plymouth?
Just on the training and making sure, going back to the staff readiness, I'd agree with everything Nicola has said, but making sure we are continually training our existing staff in our hospital, our NHS trust, so that they can step into a pandemic resource should they need to. I think that's an important piece of learning that we are taking forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Back to Stephen McCubbin.
Thank you. So, as I understand it, I just want to make sure I'm absolutely clear. Post 30th of June, there is no contract and no obligation on either of you to continue to maintain these facilities. So, because of the cost involved of warehousing, machinery, staff, etc., you will start to decommission these and wind down to complete zero. So the learnings will exist, but there'll be no physical presence of the labs. So if they were, again, required in 6, 12, 18 months' time, you'd be starting from a standing start. How long would it take to get up to a reasonable capacity? I think, Sarah, you said 14 weeks?
Yes.
But would you... So you would have learnt from the first time you've done this, so that would help. But in terms of acquiring machinery, space, etc., what would the challenges be? What have you learned that would help speed that up? And are there things that we could recommend to be put in place that would cut that 14 weeks down at all? Or is that literally the length it would take to acquire everything needed?
So shall I
yes, please, Sarah, and then I'll come to Nicola.
So physical capacity and equipment is here and will remain here on site because, as I say, it's an off-site facility, a warehouse, if you like, with the equipment maintained in it. So the equipment will remain in there. The 14 weeks is predominantly staff recruitment time. So if there's anything we can think of to reduce that, then we could go faster. Automation also of the current equipment would help us speed up that time.
Okay, so despite the cost, you're not going to release the warehousing and the capacity, the space, physical space?
No, because it's part of our future hospital plan. So we do want to use it at a future state to decamp some of the services from our hospital site into.
Okay, that's great, thank you. And Nicola, is that not the same for you, presumably?
No, it's not. So we're in a slightly different place. So beyond the end of June, we would commence our exiting arrangements in line with the contract. So we would decommission the facility. We're in probably prime NHS diagnostic space, so it's highly sought after. So we're not in a position to be able to hold that space. No. In terms of the sort of 12 and 14-week response time that you referred to there, that is our response, assuming we have space and equipment in that facility to be able to hit the 60,000. So without that equipment readily available in a dedicated space and location, we certainly couldn't meet the 12 to 14. And I know the sort of broader aspirations around the 100-day plans, we couldn't do that without a facility.
No. So if you were starting from scratch, how long would it take you?
I mean, it depends on the availability of a facility and then quite what pathogen X is going forward, but you would roughly talk 2 or 3 months, I would imagine, to find, locate, sign a facility and then start building the equipment going into it.
Okay, so that is quite a challenge. Is there anything that can be put in place that would support that? I mean, if the contract that you're current, or you probably will... will enter into on the 1st of April, were to be maintained, would that help cut that 2 to 3 months down?
Hugely. So if we look at our commitment within the contract that we have beyond from the 1st of April to the end of June, that assumes that we have the space and we have the fleet of equipment available to us.
Right.
So very much our commitment there is 12 weeks to provide 60,000 tests going forward. So we feel that based on our previous experience, we could commit to that.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Just some follow-up questions from me. Your 2 labs made a contribution during COVID, a very important contribution. I think you were 2 of 7 lighthouse labs across the country, I think I'm right in saying. At the peak of the pandemic, there were 500,000 500,000 tests a day being carried out. I think you said that you could get to about 30,000 a day. Is that the case for both of your trusts and the current scheme, Ms. Brampton?
50,000.
50,000. Yes.
Yeah.
And Ms. Newman?
Our current contract obligations till the end of the financial year, 30,000, but we have capacity within the facility to scale up to 60,000.
60. Okay, so just over 100,000, 110,000 between you. Given that we needed 500,000 before, do you have any idea as to where the extra capacity would come from, given that the evidence we've had from UKHSA is that the contracts with your two trusts will satisfy the needs of the country? I shouldn't say satisfy, will support the needs of the country.
I don't think I can answer that, Chair, I'm afraid.
Ms. Brampton, do you have any insight into this?
Well, I imagine it needs to come from the other lighthouse laboratories. I believe there are 10, not 7 in total. And the other thing I would suggest is that we need to look to automation. So, the 50,000 is on current processes. If we're able to automate our processes, then possibly we could go to more than 50,000 each per day.
I see. Are you aware of any programme to develop the automation of these processes?
I'm not personally, no.
Ms. Newman, are you?
We're working closely with our provider at the minute, so the units that we were working on during the pandemic with 5,000 tests per day per unit. We've driven some efficiencies with the supplier to 7,000 a day, but we're still talking in a much smaller scale, nothing like the 500,000.
I see. But is there any kind of funded programme from NHS England or the Health Security Agency to automate what was previously quite a manual heavy, included some machinery clearly, but to reduce the reliance on people? Is that a piece that's funded?
We have some funding within our current UKHSA contract to the end of the financial year to work with our technology supplier, but that's more about opening the platform up rather than just being COVID-19, this sort of multiplex and then the future pathogen X response. But I must say our technology that we used in our lighthouse was highly automated, so we really got a lot of efficiencies from the equipment that we used historically.
I see. And then finally from me, that as well as giving evidence on behalf of people that have run lighthouse labs, you are employed by your local NHS trust and you have responsibility for the health of your community. With that hat on, are you concerned at the prospective provision of testing capacity for your local people were these arrangements not to be in place, were they to be discontinued? Ms. Newman?
Yes, I think that during the pandemic, the Lighthouse Laboratories network played a huge role, particularly to our community services. So our hospitals were very much reliant on the local hospital service providing COVID testing for the patients within the hospitals. But our community services across our geographical area were hugely reliant on this level of testing from the Lighthouse Laboratories. So I would be concerned if it wasn't there going forward.
Thank you. And Ms. Brampton?
Yeah, I'm really proud to have been part of the national response, and it would be such a shame if that response facility were to be let go. So I think, it feels the right thing to do to keep the facilities maintained and the network that we've established maintained.
Well, thank you very much indeed, both of you, for your evidence. You've been very clear and very direct, and you've drawn experience of putting your skills into practice during the pandemic, for which we are grateful, but we're very grateful for you helping us think about the preparedness should such an event happen in the future. So thank you very much indeed for your evidence today. I'm going to invite our next witness to join us at the table. While he takes a seat, let me introduce Mr. Ian McCubbin, CBE. Mr. McCubbin is currently the chair of the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult, and has over 30 years' experience in the pharmaceutical industry, working for GSK, Merck, and IVAX. He currently chairs the Manufacturing Advisory Board under the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, but most particularly he was a member of the Vaccines Taskforce from May 2020, where he led the manufacturing activities. Mr. McCubbin, again, thank you for your service during the pandemic. I don't think you've appeared before a committee on these matters before, but it is good to be able to talk about future preparedness. Could you outline your role in the Vaccine Task Force, particularly on the manufacturing side, and give us any kind of reflections on the task force itself?
Thank you very much. Maybe before I start, it was a chance in a lifetime to be part of the response and do something good, and whilst it was stressful, I'm incredibly grateful for that opportunity. And also just to say, I should declare I am also chair of Roslin Cell Therapies, which is a cell and gene therapy company in Edinburgh.
Thank you for doing that.
So perhaps to explain my role, it was manufacturing and supply, but the chronology of my involvement might be interesting for the committee. So my first engagement on this was on the 10th of February 2020, so that was very, very early and before the Vaccines Task Force actually started. I'm close to the Bioindustry Association. Steve Bates had been asked by, he's the CEO, he had been asked by Patrick Vallance. Patrick said to Steve, this could get really bad, borders might close, thousands of people will die. Can you figure out a way to create supply chains for the Oxford University vaccine that was in train at the time, and also one in Imperial College London? So we got together on the 10th of February and we decided we'd survey the members with a view to trying to sketch out a supply chain for those two vaccines. Within 2 weeks, we actually had skeleton supply chains sketched out. And so Steve and I agreed that I would set up a group of experts in the Bioindustry Association and we would begin work on this. So this was 4 months before Kate came. The reason I mention this is it's quite important because the vibrancy of the bio community in the UK is really, really strong, and with that sort of accelerated start, it helped things progress quite quickly. And the people gave their time freely and willingly and unconditionally. I was also involved with a group that Patrick had set up, which was a much more senior group, strategic group, but it eventually gave rise to, it was a forerunner to the Vaccines Task Force. So that was the sort of first 4 months up until May. It was quite hard work. We started working with the government, a fairly junior level, to be honest, and it was hard to make things happen, but we did manage through Innovate UK to progress the Oxford University vaccine with a small amount of money and kept that moving quite quickly until the government machinery got into gear. That happened when Kate came around May, so Kate led, everybody knows Kate, and so I won't dwell on that, but Kate asked me to be part of the Vaccines Task Force with Clive and a number of other industry representatives. Steve Bates was involved in that, and that team was put together, and the period between May and the end of the year was hugely productive. All of a sudden, the machinery of government and funding connected really well with the stuff that was developing through the Vaccines Task Force, and that was really the productive time in the Vaccines Task Force. And as you all know, vaccines were eventually approved towards the end of the year, thankfully. And the sort of final part of my chronology in this was the sort of beginning of 2001 till around May, June time, and it was different again. So in the course of the sort of 3 phases I've outlined, I was leading on behalf of the BIA, I was supporting whilst the government machinery came into place, and by the end of the year it was pretty self-sufficient, so I was advising from that point. And to some extent, in the latter part, the sort of beginning of 2001, it was much less productive, but it didn't maybe really need to be. But that's the chronology of it. That's how I was involved.
Well, thank you, Mr. McCubbin. We're very grateful for that, and that is very clear. You were good enough, I saw, to sit through the earlier panel that we had when we were talking about diagnostics testing. And so you know that the purpose of our inquiry today and over recent weeks has been to establish whether we've learnt the lessons and whether we're well enough prepared for a future pandemic. So obviously some of these similar questions apply to the field of vaccines. In your estimation, do you think the UK Health Security Agency has an adequate plan with respect to surging vaccine discovery, procurement, manufacturing, all of the things that the Taskforce did?
I think the answer to that is probably not, but I'll caveat that answer in that all of us tend to make an assumption if we're not closely involved that nothing's happening, and I'm not closely involved. However, let me explain why I say that. Looking back at what happened in 2020 and 2021, no individual part of the UK capability could have solved this problem on its own. The government couldn't, the NHS couldn't, industry couldn't, academia couldn't. So the biggest conclusion I drew out of the success was that because everybody was working together, then it was effective and we pulled together the best of what the UK could do. Now, let me clarify my answer. So, I have not heard of anybody in my sphere of influence in the industry talk about how they are supporting UKHSA in a future pandemic plan. So no one in industry is talking about it. In my role in the Catapult, we would be a natural place to go, and were in the previous pandemic, to create capability either physically or through people. So I haven't heard that. I've talked to a number of academics who are leading in this field. They've had no communication. So that leads me to believe, unlikely there's what I would call a collective plan where the best of the UK capability in academia, industry, NHS could be pulled together. Jenny, I'm sure, will be able to answer that a little bit later. But if I just add a couple of other things, I am quite aware of what's happening in Europe. So our industry is very networked. People know each other all over the place. I was asked to review the HERA. I'm not quite sure what HERA stands for. I think it's the health. Let me just get this right. Can't remember. It's the UKHSA equivalent in Europe plan. And I've seen their plan. It's really extensive, and I know that actions are in place to execute that plan. And I haven't seen anything on the same basis in terms of UKHSA, and I guess finally, I think this is relevant. When I left the Vaccines Taskforce, I applied to be a non-executive in the UK Health Security Agency. I talked to the chairman. I think he was on the same wavelength around what a plan was. I went to the interview, and through the interview process, I got cold feet, essentially. And I thought, this is not a job for a non-executive. The gap between what I was asked at the interview and what I thought needed to be done was huge. And I wasn't prepared to commit that amount of time in a non-executive capacity to address it, which
you just
I'm
amplify,
completely ashamed about, actually.
Just amplify that a bit. So what was the expectation, and why was it unbridgeable, that gap?
It was unbridgeable on time, I think, because my interpretation at that time, I think it was middle of 21, it was round about then, was with things so fresh regards what had been done and what therefore needed to be done, but yet the thrust of the questions that I heard in the interview were all processy type questions, not getting things in place questions, if that helps explain. And it's one of those things where you go, this doesn't feel like I could do it in the time, and therefore entering into something that I couldn't maybe see through felt like the wrong thing for me to do.
I see. May I ask on that before I go to my colleague, starting with Graham Stringer? Who was conducting the interviews?
Well, it was Ian Peters who was the chair. I don't exactly remember all of the panel. Some of the things that happened in and around the pandemic are all a bit of a blur to me now. But I thought quite hard about whether I should actually raise this here, but it feels relevant. I don't have the detail in my head around who interviewed. I'm sorry, Chair.
Okay. Well, I'm very grateful for that. So we're going to go into some more detailed questions. Graham Stringer is going to start, and then Stephen Metcalfe.
You're using very moderate language, but you're painting a not very appealing picture. A year last January, Kate Bingham gave an excoriating picture of how the government had not used the experience of the Taskforce, which I think most people around this table and generally think did an extraordinarily good job. Would you agree with Kate?
Kate and I are very different people, and she expresses herself in a very different way to me, but the content of what she expresses is exactly the same as me. I just express it in a different way.
So you think we've not learned the lessons, that the benefits of having the private and public sector work together have been squashed really by the civil service, that the civil servants have pulled up the drawbridge, says that they will get on with it, and rather than learning the lessons, we have unlearned the lessons.
I have no personal experience or engagement in that type of conversation. I could draw that conclusion. I'm not trying to be awkward here, but I tend to prefer to talk about things that I have seen and experienced personally. I have heard all of that stuff second or third hand. What I would say is look at the outcome. I think there is no outcome tangibly there. And how we ended up there, whether it was civil servants or drawbridges coming up, I really don't know. But I think the danger is that we don't have an adequate preparation.
You've talked a little bit about how the Taskforce was set up.
Yep.
Have you got any further reflections on what was good and bad about that? And if we needed a Taskforce in the future, how we should go about it?
Yes, I have got views on that. So I think Patrick was very, very influential in how this is set up. And I think it's important. I know Patrick quite well. We worked together at GlaxoSmithKline.
This is Patrick Vallance.
Patrick Vallance. He was the perfect chief scientific advisor for a pandemic. All of his background, all of his education, everything he'd learned in industry, academia, etc., were perfect. That's a bit lucky. He could have been a nuclear physicist, which would have been great, but it would have been inappropriate in a pandemic, I guess. So the way it was set up, I think, was heavily influenced by Patrick Vallance. Putting Kate in charge was a masterstroke because of who she is and what she's learned in her career. She is exactly the right person in terms of how to get medicines through process quick. There are some structural things about how it was set up that were outstanding. Number one, Kate had a line to the Prime Minister if she needed it. I don't think she used it very often, but having that line was very, very important. We had a ministerial committee, which was I don't remember all of the people involved, right? So I'll try my best. But I think there was Treasury, there was the Cabinet Office, and there was Department of Health and Social Care. In industrial
Business
world,
department, I think, as well was represented.
Business department, yeah. Thank you. In pharmaceutical speak, that would be like an investment committee. So Kate had somewhere to take our proposals to a very focused decision-making authority that could enact what the outcome was. That was really important. And the composition of Kate's team was good. So Clive, you've met, I think, here, super scientist. Myself, manufacturing expertise. Steve Bates, Mr. Encyclopedia about the UK industry. Divya Chadha-Manek, NIHR, everything you could possibly need to know about regulations and clinical trials. So the industry experts were there, and most importantly, Nick Elliott, the Director General, outstanding at making the government machinery work. Maddie McTerminen, who did the negotiation, superb. So really, really good civil servants, which is why I kind of backed off a little bit about your previous comment about squashed by civil servants. But in this instance, my experience with these guys was amazing. Ruth Todd was my opposite number in manufacturing supply, and although she's from automotive, she was self-sufficient come the end of that year. So the structure, the composition of the team, and the decision-making points are probably the key elements of why that succeeded, I think.
You said something there that I've sat through hours and hours of enquiries about this issue, and I don't think anybody has said that before, that it matters greatly what the background and of the scientific advisor is. And we've had scientific advisors who are surface chemists, who were expert in biology, who were expert in all sorts of population genetics, all sorts of different areas. Would you think if we faced another pandemic, it would be the right thing to do to make the senior advisors to government on science an expert in the way that Patrick Vallance was on pandemics and...
Yeah, so I imagine a chief scientific advisor may need to be many things. I heard Patrick talk about climate change actually around the whole time the pandemic was on. So they're not so linear that they can't expand. But I think it's part of the question you asked me, Chair, earlier, which is the plan. So in my head, the plan would be things like, in the event of a pandemic, we should have the following process. The chief scientific advisor should have experience of all things associated with pandemic, and they'll lead perhaps on behalf of the current chief scientific advisor, who might be a nuclear physicist. I say a nuclear physicist because it's quite far removed from the need. But I think that should be part of the plan.
It's really interesting. Final point, I'm going to ask Jenny Harries this later, give her time to think about it. One of the worries I have about changing the time to develop a vaccine from 300 to 100 days, in fact, changing the time to develop a vaccine from 10 years to 100 days, you're upping the risk profile quite considerably. And if you look at the time it took to realise that swine flu vaccines cause narcolepsy, it took 8 months or so before those effects became clear. Have you any thoughts on that and how we should respond to that change of the risk profile?
It isn't actually really my field of expertise, but just to avoid sitting on the fence, I think the key to this is in the design and the numbers of people in clinical trials. And obviously the greater number of population you have in the trial would give you a much higher chance of finding anything untoward. And I think that there's always with any medicine, there's always going to be some kind of risk-benefit profile. And if the risk of thousands and thousands and thousands of people dying without something, then that always got to modify the decision-making process, which brings the regulator and the MHRA into play, and we are very fortunate in having a good regulator. And I think working out future scenarios with the MHRA in mind for such circumstances would be the way forward, in my view.
I said that was the last question, but as you brought up the MHRA, the pharmaceutical side of it is funded by the pharmaceutical industry. Do you think that's satisfactory?
I didn't know that, actually.
Right. I won't ask you to go. The device side of it is funded by the government, the NHS, but the pharmaceutical side is funded by pharmaceutical companies who clearly have an interest. But if you've not thought about it, I won't pursue the question.
All right.
Well, I'll only just make a comment though. Even in the vaccines Taskforce, there was a massive firewall or brick wall between me and other members of the Vaccines Taskforce and the MHRA to maintain their independence. And in my 40-odd years experience in the industry, I've never, ever encountered, I've only encountered complete independence. I understand your question. I'd have to think about that a little bit rather than just off the top of my head.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Stephen Metcalfe and then Carol Monaghan.
Thank you very much. Carrying on in that vein, Dr. Clive Dix made some recommendations at the end of 2020 following the establishment of the vaccine task force. Have you looked at those in any great detail? And do you broadly agree with them?
Yeah. So I remember when they were written, it was around December. I was partly involved in the construction.
Just on that before we go on, Stephen. So they were recommendations of the, as it were, the outgoing Vaccines Task Force, were they not? So it was Clive Dix and Kate Bingham, and were you one of the co-authors, as it were?
Yes, yeah. I was a lesser author, but I was involved in particularly the manufacturing and supply part of it.
Anyone else apart from Clive, Kate and you?
I think it was I think Steve might have been involved. Steve Bates might have been involved. I'm sure Divya was involved in things that were written around the clinical trial side of it.
It was the senior...
Yeah, so we had shared that, exactly.
I see. Sorry, Stephen, I just wanted to clarify.
That's fine. So obviously you were involved in those, which is great. Looking back on those, is there anything that you consider should have been changed, would have liked to change, would now like to change, like to add?
I think it would be, I think they were written in 2020, it'd be a good time to review because some things have changed, some things have not, some things have got better, some things have not. So I think it would be good for that to be refreshed and reviewed. As I refreshed myself with it, I would like to see more emphasis on a plan. So what I mean by that is a lot of what were in the recommendations were what should be done. What often happens with things that are described as what should be done is it doesn't really come alive until you can answer the question, right, who's going to do it, when's it going to be done by, and how will we know if it's successful? So I think that it needs, if they were accepted, to be moved from what into the rest of it.
That's helpful. I mean, there is... So at the moment, we had a very successful, in my view, vaccine task force. There was a lot of learning went on, some recommendations came out, but we don't seem to have anything structurally in place post that. Mm-hmm. And because of that, the disbandment of the vaccine task force, I think it has been said, has damaged the UK's reputation in vaccine development sector. Do you agree with that? And if so, why has it damaged us?
I agree with the outcome. I don't necessarily subscribe to the view that it's the disbandment of the Vaccines Task Force. So let me explain.
So separate those out for us, if you would.
Okay. So if I look in the chronology of this, when the Vaccines Task Force was in place, we recognised immediately that we were a small country in a globally competitive world for vaccines, and we were never going to be the biggest purchaser. We were on the cusp of leaving Europe and all the schmozzle that was going on with that. And so we had to make ourselves attractive to the companies who were developing vaccines. And it was very clearly in our modus operandi that we would be working in partnership with those companies to bring together a successful vaccine as quickly as possible. So it was one of collaboration. Although it was short-term, it was a strategic relationship. From the beginning of 21 and later in 21, there are some things that happened. So the Valneva situation, industry look at that and go, well, that's not a very strategic relationship. So here's a company that's bent over backwards to try and create a form of vaccine, a platform, and then we end up in a acrimonious situation where that company almost deceased. I think there was a similar thing with Novavax. I even think I am not so sure about this, but I've heard that there's some stuff with AstraZeneca as well. And to me, AstraZeneca in the pandemic was just so magnanimous and gave their resources and time and expertise to make the Oxford vaccine possible. So it wasn't necessarily the disbandment of the Vaccines Task Force that created that situation. It might have been different if the Vaccines Task Force had existed, or it might have been different if people had taken more of a strategic, collaborative approach with the industry.
So the reinstitution of the task force isn't going to repair that damage. What might repair our standing in sort of global vaccine development?
Do you mind if I slightly broaden this?
No?
I think we need to think about improving our what was the word you use? Our image, our
standing.
We need to improve our standing between pharma in general, including vaccines, with the UK as a country. We need to develop more of a strategic relationship between the two, because life sciences industries are long-term. The outcomes of a successful life science strategy were seeded in 2017 or 18 when the first one was written, which you were co-leading. If we can create a longer-term strategic view and move away from the tactical relationship that seems to exist in my mind at the moment, that would be a massive step forward. If you look at the press around how Big Pharma sees the UK, it kind of reluctantly accepts the UK, but then they build a factory in Ireland or they build a factory somewhere else. And the whole connection between the economic benefit that pharma can create is missed in the negotiations around price and uptake.
Okay.
Not sure I said that as well as could have, but hopefully the essence of it came through.
Yeah, I think the point came across. So thank you for that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Chair. We've heard some evidence from a number of people. We know that, and I want to talk about the vaccine platform itself here. Dr. Dix has been sceptical about the mRNA vaccine development, and he doesn't think it will produce sufficient future pandemic response. I think he said it was a nice deal with Moderna, but was rather more sceptical about its ability to deal with what may come down. And Sir Andrew Pollard agreed with that. He warned that relying on one vaccine technology really limits your ability to respond to the unknown. Do you agree with these? Yeah. So what should we be looking at rather than mRNA?
Well, the strategy that the Vaccines Taskforce put together was, we don't know what's going to work. Actually, at the time we were putting it together, there hadn't been an mRNA vaccine approved, so that came completely out of left field. That was why a number of people were interested in the Valneva vaccine, because if anything might work, it's probably the virus itself inactivated would create some kind of response. So it needs to be a range. I think this is a big question, and in general, you need to have more than one platform and more than one way of working to make this, improve the chances of success. The only other thing to say about mRNA is that it's not brilliant. It's got to be stored really cold. It doesn't travel very well. It's got a short duration of activity. And so,
am I right in saying that its efficacy with influenza has not been as good as traditional vaccines?
I don't know, Carol, actually, the answer to that. But I think that possibly would prove the situation. I think that relying on one platform would not be enough. It's just illogical to think that it would necessarily work, and you'll not get a better scientist than two scientists than Clive and Andy.
Have you any recommendations about how the UK then diversifies the platforms it considers?
Yes, so I was thinking about what the questions you were asking Nicola, and there's a little bit about, if money was infinite, you'd do all of them. If money was infinite, you would maintain pandemic readiness in perpetuity. But there's what I think of the pandemic lottery. Nobody knows when it's going to come back, and we don't know what the pathogen will be. So how do you de-risk it? I think we should investigate how normal life sciences work is done, what the government really wants to attract into the UK in normal circumstances. And the secondary question would be, and in the event that there was a pandemic, how would we migrate that to either a vaccine platform or platforms, a manufacturing facility or facilities that could be used in a future pandemic. Effectively, that's what we did in the Vaccines Taskforce. So, by far the most successful global company in producing the Oxford University vaccine was Oxford Biomedica in Oxford. Why? Well, they're a gene therapy company. What do? They make lentiviruses. So we moved their capability to making adeno-associated viral vaccine. So I think there is something about de-risking this pandemic lottery by thinking about your core life sciences strategy and how you adopt a pivot in the event of something significant. It's a bit like the Territorial Army.
I was actually going to mention armed forces because that would seem a kind of decent analogy, that we have armed forces. We hope not to use them, but they are there ready to go when a threat presents itself. So, but this was a much bigger threat than has been met since the Second World War, I would say, to lives in the UK. So, yeah, interesting. Is there enough seriousness been placed upon this? I mean, we really were a sense from some of the witnesses, a bit of frustration that everything was stepped up 4 years ago, and now we're almost back to where we were.
Is the pandemic lottery? Look, if we thought there's not going to be another one till 2119, that's the sort of rate they come at, you'd have it changes things, and money isn't infinite. However, I think we could make much more of what we spend, and we could make much more of what we use, and we could ensure ourselves a bit better. And goodness knows how hard it must be for people who are trying to allocate funds in this world militarily, sustainability, education, however. So we have to figure out that resources are not infinite, and therefore we've got to make better use of what we need to do anyway. It's a bit philosophical, that, but I do think if you drilled under that, you could get somewhere.
I think it comes back to the word resilience, and resilience, I think, covers a whole lot of different sectors, and this would be one of them. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Carol. Just some final questions from me, if I may, on the Vaccine Taskforce recommendations that the committee has published today. They've been submitted by Clive Dix, and we've published them on the committee's website. They were written originally in December 2020, so following the experience of that first year, and in fact the breakthrough, the triumph of having vaccines available. I won't go through all of the recommendations, but just a couple of them. One was that you recommended the creation of a new permanent successor agency, and specified that it would be within the business department. That hasn't happened. The UKHSA, which is part of the health department and its associated bodies, is responsible for this. Can you just remind us why you thought what was obviously an unusual recommendation to have a body responsible for vaccines hosted in the business department?
I honestly don't know the answer to that.
That's fine. It is a while ago. And just one thing on manufacturing, which is another one of the recommendations, and your career has been in manufacturing. We established, when I was in office, we established the Vaccine Manufacturing Innovation Centre. That has been sold and is now mothballed, I think, at last time we checked it out. Is that a mistake, or was it something that has sort of met its purpose and its time expired? And should there be something in the manufacturing space that ought to be laid down for future use?
I think the answer to the second part of your question is yes. I think there should be something in the manufacturing sector. I think it probably was a mistake, but the reason I think it was sold was the facility had got bigger. It was very, very expensive to run. And what do you do with a facility that's expensive to run, but you're actually not doing anything in a pandemic? So it's a little bit like Carol's question. How much do we spend militarily in case we might need it? If that facility was in place, not only physically would we be able to do more work, but it would have a nucleus around which other expertise could gather. And I could not overestimate how important that is in a community to make things work. So, from a straightforward pandemic preparedness point of view, that is a mistake.
Thank you. I mean, it's ironic that it was established in 2017 before the pandemic, because we seem to have a bit of a gap in manufacturing innovation when it came to vaccines. It then was rapidly expanded during the pandemic, and paradoxically then became so expensive that they needed to save the money.
All of these things in the sequence of time were very sensible. But when it comes to the point in time that you need to fund it, the problem arises money is not infinite. But in a pandemic sense, it's a mistake to have lost it.
Thank you very much. Well, Mr. McCubbin, you've been very clear and very reflective on the lessons learned. We're grateful for your past service and your current service, chairing a very important institution, which is the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult, continuing to do very good work.
And Roslyn Cell Therapy.
And indeed, the institution.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for your evidence. I'm now going to invite Dame Jenny Harries, who I see has very kindly been in attendance for most of our session, to join us here at the table. And as she takes a seat, I'll introduce her. So, Professor Dame Jenny Harries is well known, and she's been very kind enough to give evidence to this committee on several previous occasions. Dame Jenny has been Chief Executive of the UK Health Security Agency since April 2021, was previously the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, including during the period of the pandemic, and before that, she served on the JCVI, the Joint Committee for Vaccination and Immunisation, and her early career was in public health. We should be reminded. I think that was very important during the pandemic. Thank you very much indeed, Dame Jenny, for joining us here today. You've heard some of the evidence that we've been taking, and I guess there are two applications of it. One is diagnostics and the other is vaccines. So perhaps let's just start with the diagnostics. You will recall from your role during the pandemic how frustrating it was that the testing capacity took a long time to build up, and during that time people couldn't be tested, and no doubt sadly people died as a result of not being able to be tested. In writing to us on the 29th of September about what assurance we could have about testing capacity for the future, you pointed to the contracts, the retainer contracts, as you put it, with Berkshire and Surrey and with University Hospitals Plymouth as providing that assurance. That was the reason we invited them to give evidence today. But I don't think you were here at the beginning of their evidence, but you've probably heard that they said that their contracts come to an end at the end of the financial year, and with a backstop at June, which is obviously rather concerning to me, and I'm sure other members of the committee, given that was the basis of your assurance that our preparedness was in place. What is your response to that?
So I may go into a number of directions in due course, but I'll answer that one first of all. So first of all, can I just put on record my thanks to both of those institutions and all of our labs, because I think, as they described, I only heard the end of the evidence piece, but they have been brilliant in responding to the pandemic. I think what both of them have highlighted is a number of things which actually are important to me and I think government as a whole in trying to set forward a system for understanding what we think is the right amount of testing to go forward. So the pandemic preparedness is overseen by the Department of Health, and clearly we're waiting for some of the recommendations from the public inquiry, but not allowing that to stop preparations. When it comes to testing specifically, if I look inside the UK Health Security Agency, we've been doing a huge amount of work to make sure that we are absolutely clear about developing new diagnostic assays for new pathogens, how quickly we can roll them out, where that would get to, and when that can then get transferred over to industry, to the sorts of numbers that the colleagues from Plymouth and Brampton were talking about. However, I have prioritised that testing over the winter period. That's one of our most difficult periods. And as we go forward, the funding for COVID, for the pandemic response particularly, fades really at the end of this year. And we move, which I think is quite rightly, to a living with COVID agenda, because we are managing COVID in the same way that we are other respiratory pathogens. And so there are decisions, I think, for the country, these ministerial decisions to make about what totality of preparedness needs to be retained on a long-term basis. Now, some of that will be testing, some of it will be vaccine development, which we've just been hearing about, and I can contribute to that. So I think we're at a point where, and it's articulated a little bit by those colleagues from those organisations, where we're on a down period, if you like, a lower risk period during the year because we're entering summer months. We've retained facilities over the winter period, and we need to establish, in my mind, and it does relate to the vaccines conversation, what are the long-term underlying systems that the country has going forward for pandemic preparedness. And final point is, for me, these are, what I think we have seen, these are surge capabilities. So at each point, we need to know what we're going to surge and how we're going to surge. It's a scalable issue, and we may come on to the RFL lab in a moment, but one of the things I would point out there is, and there are lots and lots of positive things about that, but actually at its peak, on its peak day, it delivered 77,000 tests. So this was out of a total test capacity across the country, I think of around 850,000 tests. So it's somewhere around 14%-ish. And one of the reasons for that was, of course, because A, we had a vaccine very quickly, successful vaccine, and secondly, and very importantly for this, we had different tests. We had lateral flow devices. So where we've looked at this as we go forward, for this particular, for coronavirus testing, for SARS-CoV-2, we have had a relatively low sustained PCR capacity, and we have had a stack of lateral flow device tests. And so it's not just the PCR capacity that we should be looking at.
Thank you. I mean, to be clear, you mentioned an approach of living with COVID, and we understand that. Our inquiry is into preparedness for future pandemics, and the implication of that is that they're either not COVID or a new variant of COVID that is not susceptible to some of the treatments and vaccines that we have. So that is the concern. And if, having just taken evidence from someone from the Vaccines Taskforce, we regard the development of vaccines as being a high point of the response, I think we'd look back at the absence of testing capacity at key periods as one of the low points. So that is a lesson that we need to address. I wasn't very clear from your initial answer where the testing capacity is going to come from for a new virus, a new pandemic, given that the contracts with these two organisations are coming to an end. Where will we have that testing capacity?
Can I just, if
Please.
I may, just go back to your point, which is, so I think that, I hope, gives you a statement about where we are with COVID at the moment, why we are where we are, why we've had that capacity of test to this point. Yeah. As we go forward, we are into the vaccines discussions. It's diagnostics, therapeutics and vaccines, and we don't know what it is that will be coming. And some of our testing capacity that we have contracted can turn to a new pathogen. Some of our systems, and I'm including here the digital infrastructure as well for reporting tests, these all need linking together to be able to evaluate effectiveness of vaccines, whether we need more tests and so on. Those don't necessarily follow from the contracts that we have, which is why I think we are at a specific point in time where we need to review this as a country. Again, not all my decisions, but with UKHSA strongly contributing as to what testing we think we do want and where that testing should sit. Now, with RFL, and you may want to ask me more questions on that, very happy to answer, when we looked at this going forward and we thought about disease X or a new pathogen, as I think Dame Anna explained when she was giving evidence before, this is like a wholesale. I think you have been yourself.
Can we come on to Rosalind Franklin in due course? Because some of my colleagues have got questions on that.
Sorry, the point I was going to make was it is set up for a single pathogen. So the fact that there is potential to have a contract somewhere now does not mean that that contract would necessarily cover what we want in the future. And so we need pathogen agnostic contracts. We need diagnostic assay systems ready to set out, and then we need to understand, I think, what government ministers' appetite is for managing the risk, because as many people have said, we may have a pandemic tomorrow, we may not have one for another 100 years, and I think the minister here, the MP here was saying, actually flagging some of the ongoing costs that these are opportunity costs for other areas of expenditure.
Absolutely. When you wrote to us at the end of September last year, Dame Jenny, our question was about preparedness for future pandemics. And you said the UKHSA is establishing scalable diagnostic processes to effectively manage the initial diagnostics requirements for a significant outbreak or pandemic with a new or known pathogen, new or known. UKHSA holds retainer contracts with Berkshire and Surrey Pathology Services and university hospitals, Plymouth laboratories, which could support surge testing as required. Those contracts come to an end next month.
That is correct, and those were funded from COVID funding, which also comes to the end at the end of this financial year. Which is one of the reasons why there's a point here, as we move back to living with COVID, that we need to understand right across the country, I think on all of these areas, what proportion of resilience we need to have. The bit that I can assure the committee on is the work that we have done inside UKHSA on that initial step up is we have 11,000 tests we can push, and in fact we have tried this, we've modelled it through with the H1N2 variant, which again you may wish to ask me about, the swine flu variant, and then we can push that up to 20,000 tests, pull out new diagnostic assays, and we're very confident that will work. So we can do our bit, if you like, within our organisational remit, and we are making proposals or suggesting ways that can be taken forward for future contracts if ministers want to choose to have wider testing available.
In your answer to us, reassuring us that there was preparedness in place, you specifically said a significant outbreak or pandemic with a new pathogen. And so this may be, the two labs may be funded out of COVID funds, but you cited them as evidence of our national preparedness for a new pathogen. So if those contracts are coming to an end next month, where is that preparedness in diagnostics to be found?
So I think that, if I remember correctly, that letter is 29th of September 2023, right. And it carried us over the winter, and I stand by that assurance. I think what I'm saying now is, and I do have some very positive comments to make, I hope, on the vaccines and the element behind it. What I'm saying, though, is we are at a point, I think, where having got through a pandemic, and you've had many contributors saying that they are concerned about things that have stepped back or opportunities lost, where there are elements of pandemic preparedness which do not sit completely with UKHSA, we can contribute and wish to, but they need to be considered at a level that the country wishes to take forward, and ministers are and will be considering those. I do not, I mean, actually, I don't have a confirmed budget for my own organisation at the moment, but I'm confident we will be moving forward, and therefore I'm very confident up to the 20,000 tests at this point.
But it's fine to have a review, and it's fine to look forward and prepare, but we don't have that luxury now because these contracts move to an end, and so we're in a situation in which, having learnt the lesson that we were caught short by not having testing capacity, we now don't have testing, or very shortly, within a matter of weeks, will not have testing capacity available. We may decide, following this review, that we need it again, but we're in a position, after 4 years, in which we're back to square one, are we not? at least in capacity. Obviously, there are learnings in terms of how to respond in organisational terms.
I think there are a lot of learnings, and we shouldn't underestimate that.
That's
many people have what we have retained, for example, is a small team which retain the knowledge of the logistics.
In terms of the physical facilities.
Yes, at the moment that is the position. We're clearly not at the end of that contract, and we are in conversations.
March, and we're now on the penultimate day of February.
That decision sits with ministers, not just with me.
Well, my final point before I hand to Graham Stringer. So I noted what you said, and you said at the beginning that some of these decisions are for ministers. Ministers are responsible for preparedness, and I think the implication was that you then implement them. You had a relatively new organisation in the scheme of things, and it is called the UK Health Security Agency. May it not be the case, is there a risk that the public, noting the existence of a UK Health Security Agency, may think that you're responsible for providing health security to the UK, and in fact that may not be the case. It's the responsibility of the Secretary of State for Health, and that your role, I think you're saying, is an operational one to implement ministers' views. To what extent are you responsible for securing, insofar as it's possible to do so, the health of the nation?
So I think the new title is actually helpful. It puts the agency in a way which predecessor organisations have not been, into recognition that it's part of the national security infrastructure. And that is important because we are now contributing to the biosecurity strategy in a way which I think health has not been before. I think there were some comments earlier about why are we not considering this like the army? And I agree that we should be. We've seen what the impact on the country has been. So that's very positive. And it's not just that we do have an operational arm, and we're modernising that and trying to make that much more responsive, more efficient, more digitalised where it's appropriate to do so. And we're taking that forward. But, and we do give recommendations. The point that I am trying to make is, I think, and if I talk in real extremes, whether it be this country or many others who are considering the same things, one could argue and say a pandemic on average of this type has happened once every 100 years, and therefore actually we're not going to do anything about this as a country, and we're going to scramble in 100 years' time. Or we could say we want to retain absolutely everything that we have had through this last pandemic and retain it in case we want to act. Now, my suspicion is that somewhere in between that are some sensible parameters, but they don't sit solely with this organisation. On a positive side, and I would like to pull up because I think it relates to some of the comments about vaccines and testing and diagnostics, is that within the biosecurity strategy work, we are contributing really strongly to looking at priority pathogens and other infectious disease elements to say, on a risk-based way, to say, actually, where do we have what do we think are the ones most likely to cause pandemics? Building on work, of course, that CEPI and WHO have done, looking at where we have vaccines already or don't. There are opportunities for manufacture and liaison with life sciences, where we have diagnostic tests and don't, where the supply chains sit in behind those, because those were equally important things. So there is work ongoing, but the decisions for all of that is for me to contribute to, but not define completely.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn to my colleagues. Graham Stringer wanted to come in with a particular question, and then Rebecca Long-Bailey and Catherine Fletcher. I think we're going to need to keep the answers a bit shorter if we could. We've got lots to get through. So Graham, you had a question, and then Rebecca.
Well, just to comment on what you've said before I get to my question, I'd just be interested in your comment on what I'm about to say. I mean, there is a dispute about whether COVID-19 was manufactured or altered in China or not. But clearly, pathogens can be created or altered to be more dangerous. So it would be very difficult to predict that. And secondly, in a world where you can travel to essentially anywhere in the world, do you not think that it is, I understand why you say 100 years, it's a rational thing to say, but do you not think that, one, we may be up against something that we can't look at what's out there at the moment, and two, that it might happen more quickly because there are some seriously bad people out there?
So a couple of comments, and I will try and keep them short. So number one, I was using that as an example. I personally think it's likely to be sooner than 100 years. All the indicators are that we have zoonotic spillover, we have encroachment on from farmland onto wild habitat. We have migrant populations. We have climate change, which is going to be a real driver. So things like tick-borne encephalitis and vector-borne diseases coming to the UK in due course, not necessarily all within our lifetimes, is almost certain. So yes, I agree with you. And actually, if you look at the risk register, national risk register, the risk is somewhere around 5 to 25% in the next year. So I absolutely agree with you. I was using it as an example that there is a need for somebody to make a decision, and we can. I know where I can provide robustly from the organisation, and we will definitely be able to do the points which I've just made. The contracts beyond that need to be a national decision.
Looking at lessons learned, and all the way through the pandemic, whether it was true or not, ministers and advisors said that we were following the science, whatever that was. Just very quickly, you said at the beginning of COVID that masks were not necessary, and indeed may well be not dangerous, they may make things work. I'd be interested in scientifically what changed your view on that, and whether there have been any double-blind tests to see if masks work. And secondly, I think controversially, it was decided to vaccinate children who were essentially, if they were healthy children, were not at risk. What was the science behind that?
These are topics which will be explored in some detail, I think, by the public inquiry. So I can give a brief comment on the masks. I think if you look at the time period, and this point has been made by CMO and many others, it's in. I think both of these questions are answered in the technical report which I contributed to. What you find is the evidence, for example, around the potential for harm on masks is historically where you had flu seasons, for example, people will, and you see this, people will wear masks around their face, and then particularly in healthcare settings, for example, when somebody stops and has lunch and you put it on the table and there's a touch mechanism, they can then infect themselves from that or infect somebody else. Now, what we saw in evidence as we went through the pandemic, and this would be the same as for new pathogens, we will learn as it goes along, the evidence changes, is that actually touch risk was not as significant as first considered. You work from what you know already and what's reasonable from previous coronavirus or from other pandemics, and then move it forward. So I think this is learning that moves from one phase to the other. The detail of the childhood vaccinations, clearly those are independent views taken by JCVI. I'm not on JCVI now, so I would not personally have been involved in that specific decision. But your point is that we always have to make sure that, and actually it's right for any individual medical prescriber, that when you are prescribing something, that the benefit outweighs the any harm. And so I think, I think I'd have to refer you back to the JCVI detailed decision on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you. You mentioned that the COVID funding fades at the end of the year, and we've already heard today from two significant diagnostic labs who state that their contract for funding runs out in June. They were already operating on a reduced staffing structure because their previous contracts had reduced the volume that they were required to produce. So I just ask a very simple question first. Does the UKHSA have enough resources to ensure that the UK is prepared for another pandemic if one occurred tomorrow?
It goes back to my earlier question, which is we contribute to pandemic preparedness, and we are not just a response organisation. Actually, most of our work is on the science side, and that's where we can contribute hugely to life sciences and economic growth. And I think that is not fully appreciated often. We feed very strongly into vaccine development, new test development. But the responsibility overall sits with the Department of Health, and it sits across the health family. So as I've just done for testing, I can describe exactly what we can do, and I think I try and make those parameters clear within the pandemic plans that are being developed, and then there can be national choices about where or not risk wants to be taken or mitigated.
In your expert opinion, as the chief of the organisation, do you feel that your organisation has sufficient resources as it stands now to be sufficiently prepared for a pandemic, a deadly pandemic, if it happened tomorrow?
Well, the parts that I can define, I can say that, but no public health agency, health protection agency in the UK that I know of, historically or now, has ever been funded fully to mount a full response as we've seen to a pandemic. It would always be that something of that proportion, one would then turn to government, because it would be a national emergency. So what I'm trying to do is be really clear, to maintain the science and the scientific knowledge and grow that, and that's what we're doing. For example, we've developed a vaccine development and evaluation centre exactly to provide a front door for industry and grow that. I was meeting with academics yesterday at the Pandemic Sciences Network meeting, which I organised to try and ensure we can share those skills and keep them warm, if you like. But we will never, and we have developed new ways of pushing up contact tracing and can tell you the time frames that we can bring in contracts. But we are not resourced, and I don't think that was ever intended, to maintain the billions of pounds response that was prevalent for the actual pandemic response. And I think, we're talking about the vaccine Taskforce, but I think within a few months the budget for that Taskforce was around 9 billion. And its public space, the UK Health Security Agency, is 395 million. So we need to understand the sort of proportionality. We can do lots of really good science, and we can be very prepared to scale up. And I think that is the critical point for national response.
Your agency is the agency that is responsible for pandemic preparedness in the UK, and whilst I appreciate there are lots of different moving parts and organisations that you work with, you will have an overview of the amount of funding and resources that would be required for a pandemic if it happened tomorrow. So the question I ask you again is, do you think that the UK is fully resourced and funded sufficiently to be prepared for a pandemic if it happened tomorrow?
So I'm not the agency that has, Department of Health has the responsibility for pandemic preparedness, and we work with them. The answer to your question, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to ignore it, is simply that the country we need to be clear what it is the country wants to retain and have. Is it everything that we had, 850,000 tests a day, sitting idle? Or is it that we want to have a small capacity going forward? Now, at the moment, we have, going forward into next year, I can absolutely assure you of the science, that we can do work on vaccines, which we will do for preparedness of that. I can tell you exactly the number of tests that we can do, and that we can get a diagnostic assay out. We have excellent scientists in UKHSA. We can retain teams with the knowledge to step up. But to go beyond that, I think, is a national decision, because it's an opportunity cost for public spending. And so I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be awkward, but that is why it doesn't all sit with me.
So just to be clear, for the committee and for people watching, so for example, the two labs that we were discussing issues with earlier, their contracts come to an end in June. The UKHSA would have nothing to do with the funding of those labs and wouldn't be making representations to government. Is that, am I right in saying that?
I don't think that's quite what I've said. So the contracts for those labs have been funded as part of the past COVID pandemic response. We are moving back to managing infectious disease, including COVID, as usual. So if we don't have those contracts, we will be managing COVID in the same way that we would other respiratory viruses. So we have surveillance systems, we have laboratory testing routinely, we work with the NHS. So we're doing all that, but actually those contracts were part of a step-up system, and we can do our bit, but as I say, I think the country needs to decide. It's not for me, it is a ministerial decision. I think we've seen this already with the public inquiry, that the impacts of these of a pandemic is so significant that discussion sits with UKHSA involved, and we can recommend on tests and the scientific technical side of it, but the discussion and actual investments are beyond the organisation alone.
And have you made any recommendations or requests of government to extend this funding for such facilities?
So we're working with the Department of Health on a number of these areas, on testing, on some of the vaccines work as well, to indicate where we think there will be benefits, and it's for ministers to consider those, and they are doing that on an ongoing basis.
Are there any specific figures that you'd be able to disclose today in terms of the requests that you've made to government?
In terms of funding? Or
yeah.
No, because I think it's not... this is a decision about risk appetite and risk management to start off. The actual funding cost comes after that. So it goes back to my point about, we're in a different position. So if something happened, we can step up 20,000 tests. Actually, we've also been working on a diagnostics accelerator. So if we can manage to produce, and we've got good manufacturing now across the UK, a new LFD in 3 or 4 weeks, we might not need any step-up testing. And so there are decisions here about what you want to keep hot and what you want to keep at bay. Now, in those cases, it's really important. It goes back to the commercial interface, that we stay very aligned to commercial production lines, and that is something I want the organisation to be doing.
Thank you. I've got one final question. I'm still not clear as to whether we're actually prepared for a pandemic or not, and it makes me feel very, very unconfident. But UKHSA is responsible for the 100 days mission, and we've heard evidence that the UK is not in a position to achieve this target if there was an outbreak tomorrow. Do you agree with that position? So
I'm just going to go back to, so the 100 days mission is a global ambition. It was very much launched by the UK, the G7 in, I'm going back 2021, I think. And I know many colleagues, in fact, I had this conversation with Sir Peter Horby in a separate setting yesterday. We provide the Secretariat for the UK, so what you will see is a report that we published. There was the international report, and then we've published one on UK progress. And you will see there's a difference between the two, so I think the international report is not as positive. But if you look at the report, we're clearly not there yet, and the ambition is actually for 2026. But what you can see is quite significant progress. And if I perhaps pull out a few of those, the first one is around the biosecurity strategy, because there's a huge amount of work sitting behind that. I think somebody mentioned HERA earlier on, which is the European Emergency Response Coordination System. We're effectively doing the same thing with a UK lens. And we will be able to take that forward. But I think if you look even more closely, if you take something like the Moderna Strategic Partnership, the SRO for that sits within UKHSA. There, if you go out to Oxfordshire, you will see labs being built, and that will provide, coming back to your pandemic question, the option within 2 years, we hope, for 250 million doses of vaccine should we need it.
Thank you. Jenny, are you independent of ministers?
Well, I carry a really tricky... I was thinking when you were talking about what civil servants, I'm technically a second permanent secretary in the Department of Health, but I'm chief executive of an arm's length body, and most importantly to me, I am a professional medic and am registered on the General Medical Council. So I can to some extent choose which hat I'm wearing, and what I like to try and do is ensure I'm doing what I should be doing in all places, but keeping patients and public health right at the forefront.
Do the three of you get into conflict at any time?
Not if I think through it very, very carefully, but there are a few moments where it's quite challenging.
So, I mean, to Rebecca's point, I mean, were it the case, if it were the case, that you thought there was insufficient funding for our health security in terms of preparedness for future pandemics, would you say so publicly?
I would. It's my responsibility in my job, and in fact, that's what ministers would expect me to do: is to say what I thought. That publicly? Is the remit of the organisation, and I have been very clear in budget discussions, for example, as the organisation was becoming established.
Okay, so you give advice internally, but would you say so publicly if you were of the view that the settlement was not adequate to their need?
I'm bound by civil service rules, but I think I would feel that there was a professional responsibility to ensure that that was understood. I would put it a different way, which is I am a committed public servant and I have a professional responsibility, and I would be very uncomfortable leading an organisation, particularly with all the brilliant skills that it has, if I did not feel I had resources to make a difference to the health of the public.
Okay, obviously this committee has taken evidence from a number of witnesses. The Pandemic Sciences Institute, in their evidence to us, said that recent events have demonstrated very clearly that the UK remains unprepared with a lack of diagnostic capabilities, treatments and vaccines. Do you agree with them?
Well, I was discussing this with them yesterday. We were actually having a network, because one of the ways to go forward, I think, is to ensure that, as with industry, we are much better as the sum of our parts. And so UKHSA has a direct link into government, but actually we need the academic expertise that's around there. And if we work on different things, bits of research or whatever it might be, then together we actually can fill all of those gaps, not necessarily through my organisation, which was alone, which was your point. I think, I doubt there is any country in the world which could put their hand up and say they're ready for a pandemic. I just don't think that's true. So I think the question here is, are we heading...
We're not ready, but no one else is.
I think that I don't think anybody is, so we're no different. I think are we making good strides forward? Yes. And the point that I would pull up is the comment I was making about the biosecurity strategy, because sitting behind that is the absolute intention to be reaching out to life science industry in a coherent way. So if I take vaccines, for example, we have put out our own strategic goals. Goal number 2 is absolutely about vaccine preventable disease. Yes, it might be about ensuring appropriate coverage for existing programmes, but it is also about ensuring that where we can get ready for pandemics. So you're having seed banks of appropriate prototypes for vaccines or for tests going forward. And that is sitting behind the biosecurity strategy development.
Another piece of evidence to our inquiry from Applied Microbiology International said the dismantling of this large-scale capacity for PCR testing post-pandemic means that lockdowns are more likely to be required again, as it takes time to scale up and staff these testing facilities. Are they right?
I'm not sure I'm not sure on what basis they founded that. I think if we go back to my point about lateral flows, for example, historically, we haven't ever used lateral flow devices for whole population testing, surveillance and management. And there is a point which is actually an NPI, we do mini NPIs every day. If I have a cold and I don't want to infect my elderly relative, I stay away from them. That's a non-pharmaceutical intervention.
On testing in particular.
But my point is, testing on its own is good for understanding severity of disease. It doesn't control pandemics.
You'd agree with this aspect, surely, from what you said, nor that there is any longer-term plan for having this capacity available should another pandemic occur. I mean, you said that there isn't a plan because we've come to the end of the COVID plan.
I think there isn't a long-term plan now, but actually there are a number of areas for this, so I don't agree with that one, because there are conversations linked to the pandemic's preparedness work which the Department of Health is doing and linked into biosecurity strategy that will, I think, define what we do have on a long-term basis going forward. I think that's much better linked to national security because it starts to pick up the potential negative impact of NPIs as well as the positive ones of controlling infection.
All right. Catherine Fletcher, then Graham Street.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks so much for all the work you put in during the COVID pandemic. I remember watching you on the telly and thinking, I'm not that keen to swap jobs. And this is all about making sure that we don't have to go through that again. So we've got this disease X, that we need to prepare for. We don't know what it is, but we've got some hints in terms of recent avian and swine flu outbreaks. So if I may, let's just test how far down on the blocks you are to prepare to sprint if swine flu turns into disease X. So, recently poultry workers, there was an avian flu epidemic there. Has it changed your view of it? Is the status of avian flu going higher up the list?
So we're still, I think you had my colleague Mira Chand, who's very into the detail of this, is a specialist area to speak to you. Back in, it was a few months ago, but my point is actually the situation hasn't changed. If anything, the number of premises incidents has gone down over the last few months in the UK. And so the risk level was set at 3, that's out of 6. And what that indicates is there's mammalian to mammalian spread, and obviously there's potential for risk to zoonotic, for bird species. Yeah. But the risk to human health has not changed. Now, that doesn't mean we have taken our eye off the ball.
Well, I was going to say, are you continuing to surveil all poultry workers or just in target areas? Or?
So I think I did listen back to what she'd said, so I won't repeat most of it, but to say she highlighted some of the opportunities but also some of the problems of doing that. So you have to have the right premises, it's an informed consent, but actually we've had good success on engaging people. We actually don't have many infected premises at the moment to continue most of that work, so we will do. There is, I think there is a separate point, which is historically we offered flu vaccination routinely to poultry workers, and the rationale there was very much about trying to limit the possibility of co-infection, if you like, and
a base level of immunity to generic.
And it wasn't very well taken up,
right.
And so it was ceased. It just, people just didn't avail themselves of that service. But we are looking at that again to see if we can. If we can get a better uptake, if you like, to try and reduce the risk.
No, that makes sense. Sorry, I'm conscious of the Chair's edict to get on with it. Are you spot checking to make other potentially high-risk avian flu sites as part of the surveillance?
Yeah, we work with DEFRA, so they lead on this, but actually there has been some brilliant co-working. So I think on the One Health agenda, this is a really good example of where that agenda is moving forward really well. So working to check on both human and zoonotic genomic species, linking up with Perbrite, for example, and looking through that.
Oh, right. So you are spot checking just to keep an eye on it?
So we spot now. We have influenza surveillance, and then if we have unusual cases, and we do sentinel swabbing and various other things, and you might want to ask about swine flu because that's
I'm coming to it. I just wanted to
that variant. But we AFA will take control, if you like, of the poultry side of things, and then we will deal with any of those workers who are coming through.
But in terms of the organisational interworking, as you're referring to, if they see something that's a bit dodgy in the chicken test, they're going to ring you guys up and go, you want to have a look at this?
There's a continuous working relationship across it, and there's a risk assessment ongoing. As I say, that hasn't changed, and when we publish, we have I think world-renowned briefings, technical briefings, a bit like the variant ones.
Yeah,
for
roger
COVID.
that. So you've mentioned it. Let's come to H1N2. Swine flu. What's the implications there? Are you worried?
Well, I was on a day in November. I was very worried because. And that's my job, and that is entirely right. What happened with that particular case was, because we have ongoing surveillance, perhaps not in the same density, if you like, or depth as we did for COVID routinely when the disease was settling down, but we routinely work with the Royal College of General Practitioners. People who present with flu-like symptoms, they will swab a certain number in certain practices, they get sent off, and if they are unusual, then they will also go off for genomic sequencing. Right. And so actually, this was the first, it was an H1N2 variant, which was the first swine flu variant case in humans in the UK.
And just for the record and for everybody listening, that human hadn't been anywhere near a pig.
Well, so you say, what do we do? And this is where the operational side kicks in. So we sent out our rapid support team who went and vigorously tested the individual case, any other household members. They do very detailed histories. And I would have felt much more relieved the first weekend if somebody had said they had a pet pig. Because you will get this occasionally if you've got very close proximity. In this particular case, they didn't, which entailed us doing significant testing round.
What was your hypothesis? Where's it come from?
Well, so you will get odd cases, and we didn't find any connection. We did a lot of testing. There was a link with a healthcare setting. We tested that really vigorously and rapidly, and we found no other cases. So I think the answer to the question is, what would we do? Yes, we spotted it on surveillance. Yes, we went in really fast. No, we didn't find anything else. And there is this balance here about resource again. Mm-hmm. We had the capacity to do that, and we haven't seen any other cases. We will continue to watch.
Okay, so is this part of, you're alluding to it, just perhaps you can set out how you're keeping an eye on all the myriad of different viruses that are popping up, because, as Carol and unfortunately she had to go, has said, COVID wasn't one of the viruses that we were worried about, quite famously. So, how are you kind of keeping an eye on the trends in this thing called a virus, which actually, as you know, it comes in a rainbow of different varieties, and it's a lot to keep on top of.
And it's not just viruses, it's bacteria, and actually some of the tricky things going forward are likely to be fungi as well, which is an area which has not been very well studied. But in relation to that, this is our surveillance system, so part of the new and positive, structure for trying to detect pandemics and manage them before they actually turn into one. So finding outbreaks, small epidemics, and then trying to shut them down. We have surged a lot of data and analytics. We have new skills. We have a data and analytics and surveillance part of our system. The sorts of dashboard that we did for COVID, we're now trying to extend outwards, and you will see if you just Google, other brands will do, but you will be able to link into that, and you'll see our trial ones to ensure that we are transparent with the public as well about what's happening with winter respiratory viruses. Now, they're all behaving nicely at the moment. When it comes to perhaps more exotic things, then we have syndromic surveillance. So people, if you take something like flu, we look out for surges in people presenting with influenza-like symptoms in this country, and then those sorts of things are mirrored in the information that we receive from overseas. So we have an emerging infections team who will be looking at that, and our surveillance data analytics and surveillance team will be continuously monitoring information coming in from overseas. Of course, the World Health Organization we work with directly. We work with other public health institutes through IAMPHI, International Association of National Public Health Institutes, and then we ourselves run a number of programs which are directly relevant and have positive benefit for the globe, if you like, but also to us in information. So we have teams supporting capacity building for international health regulations, funded through FCDO and through the Department of Health. And they are local teams, but UKHSA teams. So I was out in Nigeria a couple of weeks ago, and they support other countries to develop their centres for disease control. And so what we're getting is we've also got a new variant assessment platform where we're supporting other countries to be able to build their own genomics capability. Now, the whole mix of that between professional data systems, surveillance systems means that we won't spot everything, but we can start to get quite a rounded.
So your surveillance net is anything from random symptoms popping up in unusual quantities in hospitals right the way through to just randomly sampling the odd swabs that come into GPs, and also making sure you're keeping an eye on the global events. Is that fair?
Yes, except it's not random.
Okay, fine.
So what we have actually done...
It's a Mancunian random.
Is put in a systematic approach, and all hazards, all threats, systematic approach to
But it's not mass surveillance, it's selected individuals.
So we're still running, for example, for the winter, we have run... so the ONS survey is actually commissioned by us. They deliver it for us and we we commission that alongside things like our routine Royal College of General Practitioners studies. That many of these have been running for many years, and then if we need to investigate something a bit like the swine flu in Yorkshire, then we can put in enhanced surveillance either for a pathogen or for a local community or an area.
You can have the vets testing the pigs and your crack teams testing the humans.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Graham Stringer, and then James Davis, and then finally Stephen McCubbin.
If I can just follow up Becky's question on the 100 Days mission, and you heard me asking McCubbin the question, isn't there an inherent problem of moving to get a vaccine in 100 days? That you can't satisfactorily, however good your first testing is, you can't satisfactorily know how dangerous that vaccine may be, and the quicker you do it, the greater the risk, because many pharmaceutical problems, vaccines, the problems only occur much later.
So I recognise that question from before, and actually just going back to the swine flu, just as a matter of interest, we ran that effectively exactly as we should have done, but it's like a live sample of, well, if we had disease X, what would we do, and could we push our testing out and what have you. And we also included a conversation with mRNA producer to say, actually, if your business was at this point now, would you be able to get us a vaccine, do you think? So so the answer to that was yes, which is positive for the 100-day mission.
How long?
Well, within the 100 days, that's what we were testing. Right. It won't work for all, and not all pathogens will kind of fit inside an mRNA vaccine. That's a very simplistic way of looking at it. So it's not going to happen for all of them anyway, and I am fervently in support of having multi-platform facilities across the country. I don't, or access to multi-platform facilities. This is, mRNA are fabulous for short turnaround times, which comes to your point, but I don't think we should see that they are the only way, because we want different pathogens. When it comes to your point about safety, which I think is where you're going, the reduction to 100 days, we won't reduce it to 100 days if it doesn't go through the normal safety routes. That vaccine cannot get signed off, it cannot be authorised by MHRA unless they have all of the data that they need to give it a safe tick. Now, the thing that's a little bit different, and really this should be for MHRA, I think, to provide the detail, is where you have new platforms which perhaps have a kind of one component which is repeated and then you're changing part of it, there are opportunities to ensure that both bits of those are safe separately, if you like. And so the 100 days will still go through all the normal routine systems that any vaccine would.
I accept that. I mean, if you said the opposite of that or something different, I would be surprised. My point is, isn't there an inherent risk if you do it that quickly? You don't pick up those effects that don't come out in the test, because some don't, and those that come out a considerable time afterwards. You're increasing the risk, and I gave the example to Ian of swine flu, where it was 8 months before the impact was felt for that small number of sick people who got narcolepsy.
Usually, we've got very, very good safety monitoring systems in this country, which I'm sure you're aware of. The issue is, for something like a pandemic, it's the number of people who are vaccinated. So, in fact, in many ways, it's not really the point of the 100 days, it's the number of people at which point you will start to see a negative outcome. So if you've got 1 in a million people who have an adverse reaction to something, it's only when 1 million tests have gone out that you'll get the negative query. That shouldn't make any difference whether you've done all the right processes in 100 days or 200 days. It's when you reach the number of people that would demonstrate that negative impact.
I mean, I want to make it clear, because these facts are used by anti-vaxxers. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I'm very strongly pro-vaccine. I think many lives. But there's been a number of parliamentary debates trying to examine the excess deaths that there are. And one of the concerns is that the ministers, advised, I assume, by yourself, that there is no detailed analysis of those deaths. We are just told by the minister, nothing to worry about, and there is a generic answer. Don't you think that when there are all sorts of people out there who are anti-vaxxers, it would be better to do a breakdown of the deaths to reassure people?
I, as you would expect, am totally supportive of vaccines, and whilst I recognise rarely, very rarely, there will be a harmful impact. The country has a very strong record, and actually, COVID, as you say, has saved many lives. I think I am also really supportive. We have got, if we take measles, we've got a drop in coverage, and actually, the way to support people, from what I've heard literally in communities, is they need trusted voices and they need to be able to come and ask questions. And I think the same probably applies to members of the House as well, that the clearer information that one can give, the more likely they are to be assured. I think the issue with excess deaths, the whole of the pandemic is so unusual in the sense that we have had vast numbers of vaccines given. We've had different vaccines given, and they all have their own safety records, and it is possible to do that. But linked on top of that, we have had comorbidities and significant impact on health services, inevitably because of the ill health. And I think, in fact, CMO's office, rather than mine, is looking very closely at excess deaths, because it's not just the health protection issues, it is that wider context as well. So I think if there was an easy way of splitting those numbers out very clearly, then yes, I'd support what you're saying, but I think it is very difficult to do that.
I'm sure it's difficult, but I understand that anonymised data has been sent to the pharmaceutical companies, and I can't see if that anonymised data has been sent to the pharmaceutical companies, it can't be given to the public in general and Parliament in particular.
I think that's probably a question for MHRA, who deal with the yellow card system.
Do you not have access to those detailed figures?
So we have safety reports. I mean, the safety reports go to JCVI normally, who make the final decisions. People in my teams will. I personally don't look directly at those. I mean, I have a large number of things, and MHRA has the responsibility for that. I can look into it, but it's not...
If you could provide us with those detailed figures, anonymised, I think MPs would find that very reassuring, and those of us who believe in vaccines would find it even more reassuring. Because we have, generally in this country, we have a higher take-up of vaccines than in France and many other European countries, and we want to keep it that way. And the way to keep it that way is to be open with the figures.
It may not be for me to come back with figures, but I will take the problem away and give you a response.
Just final question on the Rosalind Institute. I know you've touched on that so far, but I'm not clear whether we are in a better situation than we were in February 2020, a worse situation, or the same, and how the Rosalind Institute and other testing organisations fit into that.
The Rosalind Franklin Laboratory was, I think you heard from Dame Anna, who commissioned that. I wasn't part of that, so there's an element of this which I'm reading in the same way that you are. It was set up in record time, phenomenal build. Within about 6 months it put through its first test. But it didn't actually do, for the reasons I've just said, it didn't actually deliver huge amounts of value in the sense of the proportion of the contribution it made to the totality of testing. Now, some of that, one could argue, is a timing issue. Some of it is because of success of vaccine and the fact we'd got other tests, which is why I raise that as an important point in terms of how do we get prepared. We don't necessarily want massive labs. We might do, we might not. The other thing about Rosalind Franklin, it's not, I would just say it's the lease that is for sale, not the building which is for sale. And I share many people's ambition that I would really like to see it used in a way to support life sciences and health outcomes. There have been 2 studies into it. So Tim Briggs from Getting It Right First Time NHS work, and there was a ministerial review as well to try and see what opportunities there could be, and we've engaged with universities, life science funders, local people. We've tried to see whether there are opportunities for somebody to hold the lease and then use the different lab lines, and so far we haven't been able to find somebody who wants to take that on. So I think many of us feel that it would be is the sort of the right outcome, but then I also sit, of course, with the accounting officer hat on for public money within the UK Health Security Agency, and there is no real justification at the moment for running that and keeping it hot.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. James Davis and finally Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Chair. Vaccine development. You will be aware of a list of recommendations that was made by the leaders of the Vaccine Taskforce in December 2020. Did the UKHSA have a copy of these recommendations before this committee published them?
No. I saw it for the first time last night, and I have read it in some detail, and I'm very interested in it.
And what would you say has been achieved in terms of delivering those, despite the fact that you hadn't had prior sight?
I would say at the moment this is in the context of me looking internally, because I want our organisation to be fulfilling the opportunity that it has with its science leads, particularly at our vaccine centre ourselves at Porton Down, and to be working with industry in a way which I think the public sector has not done before, and we have some very good relationships already. When I looked at that report, I would say firstly, I hadn't seen it before, and we have not taken in to UKHSA all the parts of Vaccine Taskforce. So I think this is things like VMIC, which was referred to earlier. The big investments are sitting with OLS and not BAYS now, DISIT as the ongoing part. The Global Health Connection sits with the Department of Health, but clearly we work with them very closely. And the part that we took initially in this particularly were 2 elements. One is the developing Moderna strategic partnership, and I've been it's a very challenging system because it doesn't fit within normal civil service boundaries around risk and management. But for me, this was such an important thing about trying to bring new life science and new modes of making vaccines into the country that we have put a lot of effort into supporting that. The other element of it is whenever there is an incident, and we've heard lots of, I think Dame Anna and other individuals saying, and I've seen this in action, whenever there's an incident, everybody comes in together, works really well, and then when the risk goes to a degree, people fall back. I'm determined that we're not going to do that, but I don't have all the levers in UKHSA at the moment. So I was very interested. The vaccine agency, which is suggested, people will see it from the perspective that they have. So I think Clive Dix, as I've read it, and I'd be interested to speak with him directly, sees it from a particular angle. I can't see that because I know other parts of the system, so connecting with the NHS for delivering vaccines or whatever it may be, but I can see parts in it that we can deliver and we could grow, and so I'm very keen to take some of that forward.
Okay, so do you have a particular strategy in mind as to how to take those recommendations forward if you believe they should be actioned?
So it wouldn't be all of them, and I think we are, but in quite a small way. But if people want to encourage me more widely, the organisation is very keen to do so. We have developed, as I've said, a vaccine development and evaluation centre. We've published our own science strategy. We're majoring on pathogen genomics. There's a whole load of scientific skills that we can push towards that. We've already held industry days at Porton, and we have a commercial directorate setting up. The reason I was so interested was because I am just now at the point, as we move to, COVID vaccine being one of the vaccines rather than the only vaccine everybody is talking about, I need somehow to ensure that we continue that work, have a just-in-time responsive approach for another pandemic, but also meld that into systems that we use routinely and improve those. So it won't be a vaccines task force, but we'll be creating a mini vaccines part of our organisation over the next few months. And I think we can, with that and the vaccine development evaluation turn, to take over some of those responsibilities.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen Metcalfe.
Oh, sorry, I've just caught my breath. Excuse me, Chair. You mentioned Porton Down. Obviously, this is a complex landscape. There are lots of different parts that make up being prepared for another pandemic. But Porton Down is, as I understand it, potentially reaching the end of its useful life as it is. And there has been concern raised to us in the evidence that the availability of level 4 laboratories is of concern. And I'm sure you are aware, and if not, you're about to be, that the NAO have today issued a critical report saying, what's happening with the site acquired in 2017 in Harlow, which was the GSK site, which hundreds of millions apparently have been spent on, and yet there's still no business case, still no decision. Can you just give us an indication of what's happening there and generally across that level 4 containment?
I would just like to reassure the committee and the public, because I know there are headlines out today. We run really, really tightly controlled, high-quality containment level 4 laboratories in Porton Down and in Colindale. They have to be that way. We're not allowed to operate them any other way. People come to us from overseas to do our work, to do work for them, because it's of such high quality. What this report is referring to is a forward look. And going back to your earlier questions, Chair, about if I'm concerned about something, will I alert people to it? Then yes. And this is an area where I have. It's not the fact, I think we've heard the words crumbling. These they're not. They're perfectly there. Many media reporters have been down. We've had a day to show people around, obviously with appropriate security. The issue about these labs is, because they are so specialist and because you need such high security, quite rightly, you have to plan them years ahead. And so my concern in this case has been that the original plans, which actually preceded the predecessor organisation, if we don't have definitive plans in place and progress them steadily through, we potentially end up with a gap in future years. But those future years are 15 years down the line. They're not now. These are all functioning perfectly adequately. I think what you see also in that report is, I think there's a slightly misleading figure. The 530 million and up to 3.2 billion now is not quite right, because the original, it didn't, they're slightly different. They're right, but they've got slightly different numbers in. So inflation and VAT were not included in the first one. The critical point is there's been...
It's very unusual for the National Audit Office to make such a mistake as that. And NAO reports are agreed with the accounting officer, are they not?
No, and I agree, because it's what you describe in that. So it's all agreed. And in fact, I really welcome the NAO's review of this. I think it's really helpful. It sets out clearly, for something which is of significant national infrastructure criticality, and because it's such a long-term project and it is so expensive to the public purse, firstly, that it must go through, and we need to have a clear way through, but secondly, it needs appropriate controls and decision-making. And on this one, so the outline plan kicked off, I think the site was bought in 2017. I wasn't directly involved with that. And then, of course, you go through the site work and then you get the detailed plan. Now, the 2020 detailed plan, this was again before UKHSA, the cost was estimated at 2 billion. So I think this, because of things like changes in technical grading requirements for these sorts of labs changing, inflation, all sorts of things, and that has gone up again. So the other point about this is the site at Harlow as planned is not the same as just building a high containment lab. The original plan was to have supporting laboratories, CL2 and CL3, as well as offices for the whole of the predecessor Public Health England staff to go to that site. So it was a hub, it wasn't just a CL4 build. Now, we're a health security agency, the risks have changed, as we've all said, and therefore I think there was a responsibility to review that when the agency came into being, and ministers are very, very engaged, not only with the needs that we have as UKHSA, but also what other parts of government need in relation to high containment. We do have the biggest need, and we're the only part of the system apart from DSTL, which manage ACDP4, so that's the human high-level risk.
Okay, but at the moment there is... How long will this uncertainty around the site in Harlow last? Because if you've spent 30 million acquiring the site and 400 million getting to this point and still there's no business case, are you likely to say, well, we're going to walk away from that and we're going to do something completely different now? Or are there going to be some decisions made?
I'm probably going back to the start of this, which is these aren't all my decisions. You will realise This is an investment in a part of national critical infrastructure, and it's quite right that those decisions are made outside UKHSA, but obviously with our technical support. What I can say is they are being very, very actively considered by ministers currently, so I'm sure a decision will be made.
It's ministers who will make the decision about whether to proceed there or find the 3.2 billion or...
Government, generally, it will be more than just the Department of Health Ministers.
Okay.
But I am very confident that there will be... what concerns me professionally, going back to the point, is that the country has the CL4 containment laboratories that we need to go forward, and I'm confident that we will have. I'm very keen to see that process conclude through.
Okay. And would you think that site is still... That's the UKHSA.
The important thing about the site, there are a number of issues about all sorts of different sites. I am most concerned that we have the facilities and that they have the appropriate security. And in fact, we're not allowed to build them. That's not just the security for the lab, it's the security around the building. These are things which need very, very tight controls, and I think that's what the public would expect.
Okay. Just one final point. When the Crick Centre was built, there was discussion then about whether or not to include level 4, and I believe they've got level 2 and level 3 containment. Was it a mistake not to include level 4 at the Crick, seeing as we were spending quite a lot of money building it?
This goes back to what sort of risk level do you want, and predicting hostile and natural threats going forward. It's extremely difficult. What we do think we can do, we've been looking at anyway with our current facilities, we're very aware that academics would like to have a little bit more access, if you like, and we've been doing some work to see whether we can arrange the way we use the labs efficiently. Safety has to be the top of the agenda, and appropriately trained staff, and you can't run them otherwise. But we think there may be some opportunity to support academics, and again, that was one of the reasons I was speaking with them yesterday.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just on this NAO report, so am I right in assuming this has been agreed with you as accounting officer? It has. So you therefore agree with the what they say on page 12, paragraph 18, this is the National Audit Office. In our view, the UK's future resilience to dangerous diseases and value for taxpayers' money are both being undermined by failures in decision-making for a key part of national infrastructure.
I do, in the sense that if a decision is not made, and we haven't had clarity, it would perfectly reasonably go, this is a very, very large amount of money. It needs to go through multiple business cases en route, and actually the technical design and consideration needs to be thought through sequentially as well. They are not simple things to build. So I think if a decision continues not to be made, then I agree with that, and I think that's what the NAO is.
As things stand, of the UK's future resilience to dangerous diseases is being undermined
without a decision. Yes. If there is no decision, then I can't see that forward look for the country.
It talks about failures in decision making. So there has been, if you might be optimistic that they're about to come to an end. Do you think they are? Are you given to understand?
You can probably tell from the tone of my voice. I'm feeling very confident that with these there will be a good, a decision made on this. And as I say, my main concern is not so much about the siting. I know there will be other interest. It's very much about whether the country has the facilities, because on my watch, that's what I need to protect.
You did say a few moments ago that it was about future provision, but this facility was due to be completed by 2021.
Originally.
Indeed. So when it was planned, it was presumably thought to be needed by 2021. According to this NAO report, it will now, if the decisions are taken, not be fully operational until 2036.
If you could bear with me a minute, what happens with this is you have to build the lab and then you bring it into commission, and the commissioning and testing to make sure it's secure before you use it for high containment level pathogens usually takes years. This isn't something that you test for a couple of weeks and it's okay. The other point,
Watch, we've lost anthrax. Yes.
the other issue about this is the site originally would have had people coming into offices, for example, and it wouldn't necessarily have had all of the labs functional. So with this committee, I'm sure won't want to go into the detail, but you get into these issues of which labs are going to come on, which ones are going to be double running in different places of the country. So the time frame, we continuously upgrade all of our laboratories. We are required to. As long as we continue to upgrade them, and as long as a decision is made within a reasonable build time period, that is fine. The difficulty comes when the upgrading costs more or becomes impossible to reach the standards that is required for high containment level 4, and that's where you get into the, I was going to say the sweet spot, but it's not, it's the negative spot.
Catherine, I have one last question, but one more from me. The UK Health Security Agency, as I mentioned before, is a relatively new organisation. Is it an advisory body to ministers, or is it responsible for anything?
It's responsible for health protection operations, it's responsible for delivering science, it's responsible for delivering surveillance and various other elements of response. So we have, I'd say, an operationals and a clinical and science arm. You need both together. You can't do pandemic response if you don't actually have a maintained science going through. And we do advise and make recommendations to the Department of Health and through and with them to ministers.
Is it responsible for assuring that our preparedness, our health security, is adequately provided for?
That is a question which maybe the public inquiry needs to do. The organisation is...
I'm not talking about COVID, I'm talking about...
So the organisation is responsible for assuring its own preparedness for the things within its remit.
Its own, but not the country's?
No, not the totality of the country, because we don't have levers over all of those. So, the NHS needs to be prepared and respond. We work with them, we devise plans with them, we exercise with them, but actually the NHS itself needs to be responsible for its own emergency response and assurance.
Not providing that assurance that those measures are in place by other bodies?
No.
I see. Catherine Fletcher is the final question.
Thank you so much, Chair. To more localised business, the committee has been running an inquiry, an investigation on fungi at the moment, and one of the things that's come up in that is the issues with amphibians getting wiped out by fungi. Now, 400 million years is a long time between us and amphibians, but you did mention that there were some things that you were concerned about, potentially human pathogenic fungi. Do we need to worry? And is it possible that fungi is the next COVID?
I thought you were going to ask me about amphibians, and I was going to say that's
not
my specialist area. Yes, we should be worried. What we have seen is some fungal infections. This is more, I think, under the antimicrobial resistance. So often we think about antibiotics, but actually it's about whether we can control fungal infections as well. And in some cases, we've seen fungal sepsis, if you like, with fairly uncontrolled. So normally we don't tend to think of it as something which is particularly damaging or threatening to health, but fungi can kill. We do have specialist resource. We have particularly good work on that in our lab in Bristol. And I can certainly provide some information on that. It's probably not one that I could give you the detail of.
I'd be grateful, but you're keeping an eye on it already?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. Thank you very much indeed, Dave, Jenny, and to all of our witnesses this afternoon. That concludes this meeting of the committee. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.